one of you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants.
Today's episode is the third in a series on Celtic spirituality. I will be in conversation with John Philip Newell, a Celtic teacher and author of Spirituality, who calls the modern world to reawaken to the sacredness of earth and every human being. Canadian by birth and a citizen also of Scotland, Newell resides with his family in Scotland and works on both sides of the Atlantic. In 2016, he began the Earth and Soul Initiative and teaches regularly in the United States and Canada, as well as leading international pilgrimage weeks on Iona in the Western Isles of Scotland. His PhD is from the University of Edinburgh, and he has authored over 15 books, including his award-winning publication, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. His newest book is The Great Search, in which he looks at the great spiritual yearnings of humanity today in the context of the decline of religion as we have known it. Newell speaks of himself as a wandering teacher, following the ancient path of many lone teachers before him in the Celtic tradition, seeking the well-being of the world. He has been described as having the heart of a Celtic bard and the mind of a Celtic scholar, combining in his teachings the poetic and the intellectual, the head as well as the heart, and spiritual awareness as well as political and ecological concern. John Philip Newell, it's such a delight to be able to interview you for the Liturgical Rebels podcast. I've been a fan of yours for many years. I think I have most of your books on my bookshelves. And in fact, kind of in the lead up to this interview, I've delved into several of them again, and it's been just as much a delight as it was when I originally read them. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Christine. Good to be with you.
John Philip, you are known as one of the foremost experts of Celtic spirituality, and you've certainly introduced me to Celtic spirituality in a way that others haven't, and to theologians that I didn't know about before, like Irenaeus, and I'm terrible at some of the pronunciations of these names, Erigena, and you've helped me to understand that Celtic wisdom is an ancient tradition of seeing that speaks strongly to us today. And can you give us a little bit of your background? What is it about Celtic spirituality that speaks to your heart? And how did you become interested in it? And how did that develop?
Thank you. Well, I was reared in a very conservative evangelical Protestant tradition, for which I'm very grateful. I mean, that's not how I define myself now, but it was a tradition that encouraged me to pay attention to the heart type knowing. So I will always be grateful for that upbringing. And, even when I'm in sort of interfaith, interspiritual conversation with people from other traditions, when I'm meeting with a rabbi or an imam or a teacher from another tradition, I realize that I'm often, first and foremost, paying attention to their heart. I mean, I'm very interested in the mind and ideas, but I think that evangelical tradition, in the best sense of the word, was very heartfelt. But emphatically, that tradition did not have a a sense of sacredness of earth. And I think some of my own childhood experiences of nature were experiences of the mystical, of the sacred. So when I was a young theological student in Edinburgh, I first came across some of the, particularly the prayers that had been passed down in the Western Isles. These were prayers that were chanted at the rising of the morning sun or under the fullness of the moon at night. Prayers that were intoned at the birth of a child, the death of a loved one. Prayers that belong very much to the realm of nature rather than anything specifically or limitedly religious in use. And I remember first coming across these prayers and thinking, my goodness, this is speaking to what my soul has been longing for. And then not too long after coming across the Carmina Gadelica prayers, as they're called, from the Western Isles, I met George MacLeod, who was the founder of the modern-day Iona community. And I remember as a young theological student hearing him speak publicly in Edinburgh. I was in my early 20s. He was in his early 80s. And already, he was a great legend of a man. And the first time in my life that I heard a Christian teacher speaking passionately and very clearly about the sacredness of earth and also about the way of nonviolence, nonviolence of Jesus as a basis for true relationship, not only individually, but collectively. And I remember at that moment thinking I'd somehow come home, even though before that I didn't quite know what home, the home address of my soul was exactly. And I very clearly remember thinking I must somehow come close to this man. And I didn't know how I was going to do that, but not long afterwards, Ali, my wife, and I were on the island of Iona, walking along a path close to the seashore, and we bumped into the great man. And that was a really significant point in my life because I was now in touch with a Christian teacher who was accessing this lineage of wisdom from the Celtic world. And I think put most succinctly, I would say that what the Celtic tradition has been strong at, and the deep appeal to me in it, and I believe the appeal for many people today, is its clear sense of everything being essentially an expression of the divine. So every life, every human being, seen essentially as an expression of the divine. And so not only the sacredness of earth and every life form, but the sacredness at the heart of every human being. And this is not just a sort of philosophical, spiritual perspective that might be a sort of romantic perspective on life. This is a way of seeing that radically challenges how we relate to Earth and how we look at, how we think, how we relate to every human being, even if they're from a radically different tradition or nation, even if they belong to a nation that might be threatening us. We're being invited in this tradition to look to the sacred essence of every human being and every life form. So that I see as the sort of real heart of Celtic wisdom.
I love that. My husband and I actually went to Iona on our, we've been there about 7 or 8 times now, but the first time my husband took me was on our honeymoon. And that was my first introduction to Celtic spirituality. And it was like it turned on the lights for me. because like you, I'd grown up in a conservative evangelical approach to things and was struggling very much. I worked in Africa for a while and really struggled with how limited the evangelical view of faith seemed to be because it impacted so little of life. And so it was that trip to Iona that really opened up my eyes to a richness of the sacredness of all things that I hadn't experienced before.
Mm.
And I
What,
know that, sorry, yes,
what year was that, Christine? What,
92,
92?
1992,
Yeah.
yes. Uh,
Well, I was on Iona
At that
until,
time,
I think, until April 92.
okay. We were there in July, so I think we just
Right.
missed you.
Yeah.
Yes. In
Yeah.
fact, I know you were the warden of the Iona Abbey for a number of years. And so I was wondering, from your perspective, what is so special about Iona, both historically and today?
Yeah, Iona, this little island in the sea that sits way out on the edge of the Atlantic. It has been a sacred island in the Celtic world for hundreds of years, and I would say thousands of years. Certainly, in the Celtic Christian tradition, it has been a type of holy island, a place of pilgrimage since the 6th century, when Columba of Iona established his Celtic mission there. But even before the Christian period, Iona appears to have been a sacred island, and it seems to have been a Druidic holy island.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is it about this island that over the centuries and even over millennia, uh, what is it that has attracted people wanting to be there? George MacLeod was, I think, the first to refer to Iona as a thin place. And by that he meant there was a thin separation between heaven and earth, between
Mm-hmm.
spirit and matter. Uh, and he didn't thereby mean that every other place was thick. He was really meaning that Iona is almost like a sacrament of earth. And I think there we more readily access and know the spiritual at the heart of the physical. And Iona, certainly for someone like George MacLeod, he never saw it as a place where we should necessarily stay, but rather a place that we could go on pilgrimage or
Mm.
on retreat to renew our essence and therefore be stronger for the work of compassion and the work of justice in the cities and in our nations, building nationhood, working for a just and more equitable society and world. So it's always had that sort of outward thrust, not a place to escape to, but rather a place to more deeply be renewed. Uh, and I think that Iona continues to have that impact on
Yes.
people.
Mm-hmm.
St. Columba of Iona in the 6th century, all these Celtic monastic communities had quite a bit of freedom to establish their own rules of life. So it wasn't so much based on a hierarchy as imperial Christianity was, following the dictates of Rome. But there was a type of family likeness between Celtic monastic communities. So the communities under the leadership of Columba would have a particular rule of life. Those under the leadership of Bridget would have another, and so on. And there is a unique feature of the rule of Columba in the 6th century that I have not found in any other Celtic monastic community. And that was when Columba said, pray, he said to his community, pray until the tears come.
Mm.
Pray until the tears
Wow.
come. And, you know, the hundreds of thousands of people who visit Iona every year, the vast majority of them might never have heard of Columba and might never have heard or known the rule of Columba, but great numbers of people, in my experience, have arrived on Iona, and they say to me, when I stepped on this island, I began to weep.
Mm.
And I love what Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, says when he says, when we weep, something in the salt sea of life's origins is stirring in us again. Something very elemental is stirring. And I think that Iona is a place with that sort of energy that invites us to get in touch with these deep, deep stirrings. So some of it, I think, must be to do with the island itself. But I think that there's also a sort of an accumulated energy in a place where people have come and prayed and sought and
Mhm.
opened their souls, as people do in pilgrimage and retreat on the island. So I think it's an extraordinary combination of a type of thin place in terms of physical, spiritual interwovenness. And I think it's a place with a tradition of prayer and seeking that touches people very deeply when they visit.
Yes, yes, I would agree. Now, the one of your books that has most impacted me is Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. And I think some of what you've already talked about, the sacredness of all things and recognizing that divine essence within us is part of what has really impacted me. And I just wanted to read from it there. In the introduction, you say this book is about reawakening to what we know in the depths of our being, that earth is sacred and that this sacredness is at the heart of every human being and life form. To awaken again to this deep knowing is to be transformed in the ways we choose to live and relate and act. I love that and the contrast you make between Celtic wisdom and following this ancient way and the more utilitarian view of nature that, of course, most of the Western Church holds. So help us to understand both this difference and this wonderful view of the sacredness of Earth.
One of the features of this sort of lineage of Celtic teachers that we can access from as early as the 2nd century right through to today, these teachers in this lineage of Celtic wisdom have all taught that what is deepest in us is of God rather than what is deepest in us being opposed to God. And therefore, there has been no place in this tradition of wisdom. There's been no place given to anything like what uh, has dominated so much Western Christian teaching, and that is the doctrine of original sin,
Mm-hmm.
which has wanted to say that what is deepest in us is opposed to God rather than what is deepest in us being of God. One of the big implications, and there are so many implications to saying that what is deepest in us is of God, is to say that deep within us is the wisdom of the divine, that we simply haven't just been made by God, we are made of God,
Mm-hmm.
that our very essence is sacred. It's come forth from the womb or the essence or the heart of the divine. So this is to say that the wisdom of the divine is deep within us, and it's deeper than any ignorance in our life. It's deeper than any of the falseness that we have enacted or become in our relationships. And it's waiting to be born again. It's waiting to come forth again in new ways. So when I speak of reawakening to what we already know, this is an extremely liberating aspect of the Celtic tradition, because it means that um, when we try to utter truth uh, to other people or to one another, we're not thinking that we're trying to utter a wisdom that isn't already in the heart of the listener. What we're attempting to do is to find language, to find utterance, to find expression that stirs back up into wakefulness the wisdom that's already there. And I had a really sort of beautiful and important experience many years ago, shortly after writing one of my first books on Celtic spirituality, which I called Listening for the Heartbeat of God. And in that book, I speak about the newborn child um, as an expression of the divine, rather than this perverted notion that has dominated a lot of our Western Christian inheritance, which is wanted to say that what is deepest in the newborn child is opposed to God rather than being of God. But at the end of my talk, I was giving a talk in Virginia at a little church. And at the end of the talk, a woman, I think in her 80s, came very purposefully up the central aisle with a copy of Listening for the Heartbeat of God in her hand. And she was walking up the aisle so purposefully that the naughty boy in me thought, I think she's going to hit me over the head with it. And I was quite wrong, thank God. When she got up, she said, I want to show you what I wrote in this book after reading it. And she opened the front cover, and inside she had written, I knew it, I knew it, knew it. I so often wish I had asked her for that copy. She so simply and succinctly expressed what our experience is when we hear truth that has been neglected.
Yes.
We may have never heard it before, it may never have been taught to us, but when we hear it, something deep within us says, I knew it. And I think if I had thought to ask her for that copy, it would be with me now. It would be with me every time I teach and every time I write, because it would be a very physical reminder to me that my role as a teacher is never to think that I'm writing or saying a truth that isn't already in the heart of the listener. So our role as teachers or as accompaniers of one another is to simply try to give expression to what is already in the heart of our listener, to offer words, expression that simply calls the other back, in a sense, to a knowing that is deep within us and that we are made of God.
Beautiful. Well, and another thing that you talk about is that Celtic wisdom remembers the sacredness of the feminine. And of course, as a woman, and I think for many women, of course, this really resonated with me as well. And I think that Bridget of Kildare is one of my heroines. Can you tell us a little more about her and your growing understanding of the importance of the sacred feminine?
Mm. Well, in so much of our Western world, and led in many ways um, by Western Christian doctrine and religious teaching, there's been a tragic neglect of Earth, not only a neglect, but often a sort of subordination of Earth. And hand in hand with that has gone a neglect and a subordination, and indeed often an abuse of the feminine. So earth wisdom and feminine wisdom, or a recovery of awareness of earth and recovery of the sacredness of the feminine, I believe go hand in hand. And they certainly went hand in hand in the Celtic world. So Bridget of Kildare, 4th, 5th century Irish saint, is is like a powerful icon of both sacredness of earth and her intimate relationship with creatures, and is also a sort of icon of the sacred feminine, uh, in terms of its deep wisdom, its the sacred feminine. And by sacred feminine, I'm not just speaking about women. I am speaking about what it is to be made of God. And I believe that in God there are both sacred masculine energies and sacred feminine energies. And I think that these energies are meant to meet. They're meant to dance them together. They're made to make love within us, and among us in our communities, and in our nations. And so many of our nations have been under the influence and leadership of a type of shadow masculine energy that has arrayed itself up over against earth, and often tragically against the feminine. So Bridget is this sort of fascinating character. I mean, for many years, the sort of my more limited academic mind felt I can't really write about much about Bridget because I don't have any writings from her hand, as I do with the other great teachers in this lineage. But finally, thank God, I woke up to the realization, I don't need writing directly from her hand to speak of how she is an icon of earth and of the sacred feminine, because what we have is many myths and many legends, many stories about this extraordinary woman, and and these myths and legends uh, don't necessarily have to be describing an historical personage. They can also reflect what has been dear to the Celtic heart over the centuries, a type of intuitive knowing of the divine in earth and in the sacred feminine as well. And that in part is what makes her such a wonderfully colorful figure. And just to give you a sort of little indication of the way myth grew up around Bridget, it was said in the Celtic world that Bridget was the midwife at the birth of the Christ child.
I love
Now,
that.
this causes no problem to the Celtic imagination that a 5th century saint could be present at the birth of the Christ child in 1st century Palestine. Because what the imagination is often doing is speaking from within the one world, in a sense, within all time, within all space. And it was a way of saying that the Christ mystery was born in Ireland in large part through this great woman. And she is not only described as the wet nurse, as the midwife, but as the wet nurse of the Christ. And that points to the way in which she nurtured the Christ wisdom in Ireland with her very being. So the stories are just fantastic.
They really are. I
And,
agree.
and within them are often deep spiritual perceptions and celebrations.
You already mentioned the Kamea Gadalika and the beautiful prayers that have come down to us that I know I've certainly been enriched by and have used, and I think as many people do now, kind of use them as something to spur their own creativity in terms of the writing of prayers and enriching their spiritual life. Tell us a little bit about, the poetry and the prayers that was so much at the heart of the Celtic spirituality. And I know you're a poet yourself, and the how it's impacted what you write in terms of poetry.
Mm. Yeah, so the Carmina Gadelica volume, 6 volumes
Mhm.
of prayers that were collected in the 19th century by a Scot named Alexander Carmichael. And for many years, he wandered the Western Isles and other parts of the Highlands, and he collected from men and women prayers that had been passed down in the oral tradition for hundreds of years. And it is thought that some of the prayers that he was collecting from the oral tradition dated right back to the period of Columba, the 6th century period of Columba on Iona. So these were prayers, as I think I mentioned earlier, that were used in the context of the rising of the sun, or prayers that were uttered or intoned under the fullness of the moon at night, prayers that would be chanted as the morning fire was lit on the hearth, or as it was smothered or covered at night, prayers that were uttered in the weaving of cloth together, or in the milking of the cows, prayers very much of day-to-day life, and prayers that were intoned at the birth of a child, and very beautiful prayers that were offered, sung, uh, recited at the death of a loved one. So prayers that point to the sacredness of the cycles of life, and the great sort of spectrum of nature as expression of divine. And these prayers were emphatically disapproved of by the 16th century reformers, and then the sort of 17th century Calvinism in Scotland. And it led eventually to an attempt by the sort of Calvinist reformers in Scotland to literally try to beat these prayers out of the people.
Amazing.
So if children at school were heard reciting some of these ancient prayers, they would literally be beaten by the headmaster. And then not only that sort of persecution, religious persecution, but then the tragedy of the Highland clearances came when close to 100,000 Scots were cleared off their ancestral lands to make way for more sort of financially successful sheep farming by the landowners instead of small-scale tenant farming. And sort of the Highlanders and Islanders were sent to the cities or sent into exile to Australia or Canada or America. And I in fact wrote a script for a live stage production of these prayers, with dance, music, and song. And it's just about to tour Scotland again.
Lovely.
We've already had a tour in the past, but it's been so deeply appreciated that this time we're taking it right out into the islands, out to the very people whose ancestors were silenced and
Wonderful.
driven into exile. So that's the Carmina Gadelica tradition, and it comes particularly from the Western Isles. We find parallel collections in Ireland and in Wales, but this collection that Carmichael put together in the 19th century is a very fulsome collection, 6 volumes. And if he had not made his collection when he did, they would have been lost in history, because it was in the midst of the clearances. But although these particular prayers come out of the Western Isles, there's something very poetic generally about the Celtic tradition of wisdom. And it's quite interesting looking at the great teachers over the centuries, because they tend not to be looking for philosophical or doctrinal language to point to the one who cannot be named, the one beyond names, the one from whom we've all come. So what we tend to hear from them is not philosophical terms or doctrinal terms, but they'll refer to the sun behind the sun, or the soul within the soul, or the truth within every life. And I think in that sense it's a tradition, a mystical in some ways tradition that knows the limitations of language, knows the limitations of thought, and knows that what cannot be said about the divine is always greater than what can be said. So it tends to want to use poetic utterance rather than anything that might be considered a literal definition or description of the divine. And in that sense, I see myself as standing in this tradition, and I've written many prayer books that uh, access a poetic expression. And it's really interesting for me to sometimes write a book in prose, a spirituality book, such as Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, or such as the new book, The Great Search. And when after I've written and published a piece of prose, I find I can look at it, and in a sense, I see myself all over the page. But when I read prayers that I've written in the Celtic mode of expression, I don't recognize the prayers as specifically mine. And I think that's because in poetic prayer, and when we're drawing from those deep sort of creative depths of the human soul, we're drawing from within us rather than from within me in a limited way. I mean, I think that our mind tends to be more sort of limitedly individual than the soul is, and I think that's what the great Celtic poets are doing. They're drawing from that place that is deep within us all, and therefore they're giving expression in ways that I think are much richer than ideas that come from the mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Now, you mentioned your new book, and which is just out, The Great Search, Turning to Earth and Soul in the Quest for Healing and Home. And whereas in Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, you introduced us to a lot of voices from the Celtic tradition, in this book, you introduce us to a whole new array of voices, what you call prophetic voices, not just from the Christian tradition, but from other traditions as well. And I found this very fascinating and inspiring because I think, like you and like many, I think of our audience, I have recognized that God speaks to us through all streams of life. I mean, I remember from my childhood, my father was Greek, and my um, aunt was a very strong Greek Orthodox Christian. But growing up in the evangelical church, I was taught to dismiss that, basically. And, one of the regrets as I look back on my life is never having really had a chance to know her and the deep faith that she held. And I think as I read, I haven't read the whole book, but as I started to read this book, I was made aware of the fact of the other rich array of voices in other traditions outside Christianity that have truths that we've dismissed. And I think this is part of what you're addressing in this book. So can you tell us a little bit about the Great Search and the voices that you bring into that book?
Yeah. just to sort of maybe back up a bit to talk a little bit about my approach to teaching and my approach to writing. A number of years ago, during one of our Iona pilgrimage weeks, often at the end of our pilgrimage week together, we go around the circle of about 50 people, and we invite people to speak one word that expresses their gratitude for what has happened and what they've received on the island and from one another and from the rituals, earth-related rituals and the teachings. And this particular week that I'm remembering, there was a Buddhist gentleman there, and his wife was Christian. And when we got around to him, the word he used, interestingly, was transmission. And this is an important word to our Buddhist brothers and sisters, because in Buddhist wisdom, it's understood that the teacher is not to be seen so much as an original fount of wisdom, but rather as someone who is transmitting wisdom from the past and speaking it in new ways for today. And when I heard that word, transmission, I thought, that's exactly what I really love to do. I love to distill the wisdom of great teachers, great prophetic figures before us, and try to offer their wisdom for this moment in time. And that's certainly what I did in a book like Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, but sort of drawing on Celtic, Christian Celtic prophetic figures. And in this book, I do something similar, but it's not from the Celtic Christian world. It's from great spiritual traditions from all of the world, and finding some pretty interesting resonances between these Celtic, these prophetic figures from many spiritual traditions and the Celtic, and particularly the 9 teachers that I draw from. What is common to them all is a sense of sacredness of earth and sacredness of the human soul. These 2 features that have been very dear to the Celtic world. So that's part of the sort of methodology of the book, as it were. And one of the things that I love and so appreciate about this way of teaching, this way of writing, is that when I'm preparing for the writing of a book like The Great Search, I'm being deeply fed by 9 great prophetic figures, and my my belief is that, well, if I'm being fed, then there's more chance that what I have to offer is going to be a blessing for readers and for other people as well. And I think the other thing that I'd like to say about The Great Search, in terms of why I've looked to these particular 9 teachers from many nations and from different spiritual traditions, is that many of our Christian brothers and sisters, and I would say not only hundreds of thousands, I would say millions of our brothers and sisters who began life within the 4 walls of the church are no longer there. And why aren't they there? And part of what I'm looking at is not just the fact that so many of our brothers and sisters are no longer within the 4 walls of our religious inheritance. What I'm looking at is, well, what are they searching for? What are they yearning for? Because many of these people may not be particularly or formally religious in their expression, but the vast majority of them are still deeply spiritual people. They're still alert with their spiritual yearnings? What are the longings? And I believe that paying attention to the deepest yearnings of the soul is a really important part of the way forward. Um, that it is by paying attention to these yearnings, allowing them to become more conscious within us, and nurturing them, helping to translate this sort of yearning into action and how we're trying to shape our lives and shape the world. So that has led me to realize that 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 part of what's happened in so much sort of Western Christian thought is that we've got quite sort of trapped often and have ended up only looking to Christian teachers rather than the wisdom that can be heard and accessed in teachers from a whole variety of teachers, traditions. And someone like Thomas Berry, who is the first prophetic figure that I draw from. I mean, he happens to be a Christian, and he was a theologian, but he preferred to call himself a geologian because he was so focused on sacredness of earth.
Yeah.
He says that sort of religious diversity is as important to the human soul as biodiversity is to the planet. And I think this is really important, that just as biodiversity is so essential to the well-being of the whole planet, I believe that hearing the wisdom of great spiritual traditions and teachers from other great religions is important for sort of filling out our consciousness of the divine.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you were speaking, I was reminded of I'm a keen gardener, and when I started really connecting to the sacredness of earth in the garden, I went looking for books that would help me in that search. And the first book that I came across that I found really helpful was written by a Zen Buddhist. And, once upon a time I was no, I can't possibly read this. But fortunately, things had changed by the time I got into the sacredness of earth and the sacredness of gardening. And it was a very helpful book. And I think, we need those different perspectives. They help keep us growing, and they help us connect to other people and to God's good earth as well in the ways that we're meant to. So,
that I think that that religious diversity of thought doesn't lead us to sort of water down the essential wisdom of our own tradition. I don't think it's not about sort of melting everything down to a sort of commonality. I think the teachers from other traditions that I've come very close to, and teachers that love me and I love them, they look to me to be very true to the wisdom of Jesus. They want me to speak the wisdom of Jesus. They're not looking to me to sort of somehow play down the beauty of my own tradition, but they are looking to me to, and I look to them to be open to being attentive to wisdom wherever it comes from.
Yes, yes, yes. And I think that's a very good note to end on, because I think that that's probably one of the big lessons that I'm learning as I'm reading The Great Search, is that being open to that wisdom that comes from other people's, the importance of that, and that we need to have wide open minds to all the voices through whom God is speaking, the prophetic voices, both from the past and from the present as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. Many blessings to you.
And to you too. In today's episode of The Liturgical Rebels, I was in conversation with John Philip Newell. We discussed his interest in Celtic spirituality and the sacredness of the earth. He shared his journey growing up in a conservative evangelical tradition and then how his experiences in nature led him to explore Celtic wisdom. Newell talked about the significance of Iona in the Celtic tradition and its role as a thin place where heaven and earth meet. He also emphasized the importance of recognizing the sacredness of all things and the divine essence within every human being. Newell discussed the power of poetry and prayers in Celtic spirituality and the need to embrace religious diversity in our search for wisdom. He also introduced us to his new book, The Great Search, Turning to Earth and Soul in the Quest for Healing and Home. In the next episode, we will continue our exploration of Celtic spirituality with Christine Valters-Paintner. Christine is a Benedictine oblate and the online abbess of Abbey of the Arts, a virtual monastery integrating contemplative practice and creative expression. She is a poet and the author of more than 20 books on the spiritual life. Her newest book is A Midwinter God, Encountering the Divine in Seasons of Darkness. Christine lives on the wild edges of Ireland with her husband John and her dog Sawney, where they lead online programs for a global community. I am Christine Syne, author of the soon-to-be-published book Celtic Advent, Following an Unfamiliar Path. My other books include The Gift of Wonder. I also facilitate the God Space Light website and write regularly on Substack. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast. Please also share it with your friends or join me on Substack, Instagram, or Facebook.